If you ever meet a student of philosophy, a graduate student in the advanced stages is best for this purpose. If you ever meet a philosophy student, ask him or her a question. Ask him why he's studying philosophy. Chances are you'll get a variant on one of the following three answers, depending on the subject of your experiment. If he's inclined to be idealistic, your interlocutor may tell you that he is studying philosophy because he wants to acquire knowledge and that he values knowledge for its own sake. Or if he's somewhat more of a realist, he may answer you in professional terms. He is studying philosophy because he wants to be a professional philosopher, a member of the philosophy department at a good university, a member of the American Philosophical Association, respected and esteemed by his colleagues for his contributions to the field. Or finally, if he's realistic to the point of being crass, he may say that he's studying philosophy in order to get a job. Philosophy is something he does rather well and likes to do, and he hopes that if he gets a PhD, someone will pay him a comfortable salary to do it. It is not impossible that you will get all three of these answers, or combinations of them, from the same person. But now you have been thinking about St. Bernard, and you recall that what you have just heard are recommendations of curiosity, vanity, and/or commerce. But you also recall what St. Bernard said about charity and wisdom. If then, with this in mind, you recommend to your interlocutor that he might seek philosophical knowledge in order to edify others, he will probably take you to be recommending a teaching career. And while he will admit that he will doubtless have to do some teaching in order to earn a living, while he may even say some encouraging words about the importance of teaching and how much he personally values it, he will also, especially if he is in the later stages, allow that the center of gravity of philosophic study is elsewhere, in pure research or in professional interchange. If you persist and recommend to him what Bernard calls the course of wisdom or prudence, that he seek knowledge in order to be edified, he will probably mutter some words about irrelevant piety and hurry off to more important and more relevant affairs. My portrait of the philosophy student is, of course, a caricature. But it is, I think, a caricature of a reality. And I hope that it's a good caricature. That is, that it exaggerates the salient features of its original. It is interesting to reflect on what has happened to our conception of the pursuit of knowledge since the 12th century. Most of our contemporary motives for studying philosophy fall under St. Bernard's heads of curiosity, vanity, or commerce, all of which he stigmatizes as shameful. And on the other hand, the motives Bernard recommends, charity and wisdom, the edification of self and others, would nowadays be regarded as secondary at best and piously irrelevant at worst. Now, of course, you may think Bernard was a monk, and monks can be expected to say things like that. But then I would remind you of some history, namely, that for centuries everyone said and believed things like that, monks or not. None of the ancients thought, for example, that knowledge was an end in itself. Plato is clear about it. Philosophy is the love of wisdom, and wisdom is loved because we think it will make us happy. That is, it will edify us, make us better men, and it will beatify us. For the better we are, the happier we shall be. Medieval Christians, beginning at least with St. Augustine, agreed. Of course, by happiness, they meant something bigger than Plato had dreamed of. They meant heavenly beatitude, the vision of God. And since they also believed that this beatitude was promised to all men, not just to intellectuals, they thought that the philosopher had a duty to edify others that was just as imperative as his duty to edify himself. He was, in his own manner, to love his neighbor as himself. The motive of charity added to the motive of prudence. As you all know, the Middle Ages thought of philosophy as the handmaid of theology, ancilla theologiae. And this I take to be the meaning of that phrase. Philosophy is the pursuit of knowledge, but knowledge is not an end in itself. It is in the service of the larger and more ultimate ends of man. And these ends, the edification of oneself and of others with a view to beatitude, are defined by theology. Philosophy, then, is essentially the servant of theology. The subordination of philosophy to theology, whatever abuses it may have occasioned, is not an involuntary servitude of the intellect. It is the condition on which alone philosophy can achieve its own ends, without frustration and without perversion. For if the pursuit of knowledge is not directed toward the service of the true end of man, then it will either be left without a purpose altogether, or it will be turned aside to the service of lesser and less true ends. From this medieval point of view, the story of Western philosophy subsequent to the Middle Ages is pretty much the story of the ruination of the handmaiden. A century or so after St. Bernard, for historical reasons that we cannot go into, philosophy began to assert its independence of theology. In another couple of centuries, it had pretty well achieved that independence. But what was philosophy to do with its newfound autonomy? Why, of course, just what everyone does when he first achieves independence. He asserts it. And so did philosophy. Philosophy, having achieved its emancipation from theology, insisted at first that the pursuit of knowledge was an end in itself, or, in other words, that knowledge of itself would suffice for all a man's essential needs. But of course, knowledge itself is not an end, and no one can be content for long merely to assert his independence. You have to do something with it. So philosophers, having for a while been content to enjoy their independence of theology and to amass knowledge for its own sake, began to look around for something to do, some end their pursuit of knowledge might serve. And they found it. For almost concurrently with the separation of philosophy from theology, something else happened. What we now call the sciences, things like physics, biology, psychology, and the rest, were for centuries parts of philosophy. But about the time philosophy began separating itself from theology, the sciences began separating themselves from philosophy. One by one, they cut themselves off from their parent, and philosophy was left at last holding the loose apron strings. Now then, and of course I'm leaping centuries in a single clause, philosophy, having left the service of theology, and having lost most of her subject matter to her offspring, entered service of the sciences. Unfortunately, they were in the same boat as philosophy. Like philosophy, the sciences had once served theological purposes, but now philosophy and the sciences together were on their own. What they did with their liberty is the history of civilization since the Renaissance. I fear you will think my sketch of the history of thought even more outrageous than my earlier caricature of the philosophy student. And so it is, of necessity. But even if you do not care to acknowledge the portrait as a whole, I hope you may still agree that I have drawn attention to some salient warts. In any event, my portrait or caricature of the ruined maid will suggest, perhaps, why philosophy so often takes the form it does in modern and recent times, why it is so often the codifier of scientific method, the analyst of scientific concepts, and the interpreter of scientific results. It will also perhaps suggest why it is that the motive for seeking knowledge these days is so seldom what it was for St. Bernard, a charitable and prudent concern with edification, and why it is so often the very thing Bernard pronounced shameful: curiosity, vanity, or commerce. For when philosophy ceases to be the handmaiden of theology, and when the sciences themselves no longer care to be the subalterns of philosophy, then philosophy becomes what it all too often is nowadays: a science without a subject matter and a profession without a purpose. When philosophy changed mistresses, she changed motives, so that when it does not cop out altogether and become an intellectual or linguistic game, the love of wisdom turns into a critique of pure cognition, an instrument of power and prestige, or at the bottom of the barrel, a way to get a job. I hope I have not suggested by these remarks anything derogatory to the sciences. Their theoretical achievements and their practical benefits are beyond my capacity either to bless or to damn. But I have wanted to suggest a derogation of the ends sought by both philosophy and the sciences when they serve purposes less ultimate and less worthy than charity, wisdom, and beatitude. In other words, philosophy, when it ceased to be the handmaid of theology, tacitly pledged itself to the promotion of the threefold end of power, pleasure, and magic. And that brings me to part 2, the world, the flesh, and the devil. Everything I have said in part 1 can be said more economically, doubtless less tendentiously, and without even the pretense of history, in these words: the intellect in search of knowledge will always serve some end, either an end superior to knowledge, such as beatitude, or some end inferior to knowledge. For knowledge itself is not an end. By itself it does not satisfy the intellect, for the simple reason that it cannot satisfy the man who has and exercises the intellect. And so, those men who claim to seek knowledge for its own sake always wind up, in fact, seeking knowledge for the sake of power, seeking knowledge for the sake of pleasure, or transforming knowledge itself into a kind of magical gnosis. In the first of his apostolic letters, St. John the Evangelist wrote, "Do not love the world or the things that are in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Because all that is in the world is the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, which is not from the Father, but from the world." Classical exegesis has always taken these three fascinations of the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, to be identical with the three temptations by which Satan is said to have tempted Christ in the wilderness. Turn these stones into bread and eat. That is the lust of the flesh, or the temptation of pleasure. Throw yourself down from the pinnacle of the temple and let your angels bear you up. That is the pride of life, or the temptation of power. Fall down and worship me, and the glory of the world shall be yours. That is the lust of the eyes, or the temptation of magic. I do not mean to indulge in exegesis here. I only want to call your attention to these three classical loci of temptation: pleasure, power, and magic. Or, in an even more classical phrase, which I here regroup in order to preserve the symmetry, the flesh, the world, and the devil. And I want to call your attention to a certain order that I seem to perceive among these three traditionally diabolic agencies. A little while ago, I suggested that the idea of seeking knowledge for its own sake was a modern idea. Not that no ancient ever thought of it, but rather that it first became a big and important motive in the history of modern thought. The intellect, freed at last from the fetters of dogma, made its freedom an end in itself. That is, it insisted on its sole sufficiency to achieve knowledge and on the sole sufficiency of the knowledge so achieved. But I also suggested that this motive is not very durable. Knowledge alone, however it might suffice a putative pure intellect, will not suffice the intellect of a human being. Human beings are not fulfilled by cognition alone, and in fact they always seek cognition for the sake of ulterior satisfactions. St. Thomas Aquinas once observed that all men need delectation, and that if a man is deprived of spiritual delectations, he will turn to the carnal. So, when the seekers of knowledge rejected the hope of heavenly beatitude as their ulterior aim, they turned to the carnal. Already very early in the history of modern thought, at least as early as Francis Bacon, the seekers of truth knew that knowledge is power. And in the course of time, it has become clear, this is another of those historical points we cannot stop to explore in detail, it has become clear that science was essentially technological from its very inception. Not that all scientists have always been concerned to build bridges or nuclear weapons, no. The overtly technological development of science has been fairly recent. But from the outset, science has been essentially technological, bearing within itself the portent of the recent rash of technological expansion. That is to say, science has always conceived both its subject matter and its method technologically. It has conceived its objects, the things of nature, as things calculable and manipulable, pliable to the purposes of human intelligence. It has, in other words, conceived things as potential utensils. And it has conceived its own methods as methods of manipulation and control. Even the experimental method itself is a way of manipulating natural objects and powers to get the results we want. Often, of course, the results desired are purely theoretical. We often speak of the cognitive fertility of an hypothesis, by which we mean it will give us more to do, it will suggest further hypotheses, new experiments, and the like. And we often value such fertility more than truth. But the technological motive, the motive of power, is there, however latent, and it will sooner or later assert itself openly, as by now it has, with a vengeance. When the intellect turns from the service of beatitude, it undertakes then to be the instrument of power. Power, of course, is an ambiguous thing, as the history of technology itself has shown. It makes wonder drugs and atomic bombs with equal facility. Power itself is instrumental. And of course, instruments, all but the most highly specialized, instruments can be used for a variety of ends. To what end, then, is this power to be turned? This power for the sake of which we have sought knowledge. In the absence of spiritual delectations, men will seek the carnal. And so, the hope of heaven, indeed even the interest in heaven, far behind us, we have used the power of knowledge to produce pleasure. That would be parody, and it would be unjust parody, to suggest that the aim of the pursuit of knowledge has been better things for better living through chemistry. and it would be downright ungrateful, not to mention hypocritical, to let on that one did not rejoice in penicillin and polio vaccine and things of that sort. But that's not what I mean to suggest at all. What I do mean to say is that we have almost exclusively turned the pursuit of knowledge, which has become the pursuit of power, toward completely secular ends. We have sought to know not for the sake of beatitude, but for the sake of pleasure, careless of the fact that, as St. John also said, the world with its lust is passing away. We have devoted ourselves with remarkable concentration to the satisfaction of worldly lusts, which in the nature of the case are insatiable and which in the long run cannot make us happy because they are even more transient than we ourselves are. First part of this talk was full of outrageous caricature. This part is becoming offensively sermonic. I apologize. But, however I may have heated it up with rhetoric, my main point is quite cool and factual. The exercise of intelligence will always serve some end. It has, in fact, chosen to serve the end of power. And power, in turn, has been used to procure those transitory worldly satisfactions to which we give the name pleasure. And all this has happened because we have historically rejected the service of transcendent and eternal purposes. One further point. Knowledge conceived as power will sooner or later overreach itself. It has already done so. And by now it is no longer the mark of a Luddite to see in the expansion of technology a threat rather than a promise. Technological growth is no longer an unequivocal honorific. Look at what's happening to your own city. Moreover, the enjoyment of pleasure, no matter how refined the technology that ministers to it, eventually palls. It even turns on itself and becomes a source of misery. We can now keep human vegetables alive almost indefinitely, and we begin to wonder if they might not be happier if we didn't. As a result of the sexual revolution, made possible to a great extent by technology, we have discovered countless new ways to frustrate ourselves. Or rather, we have learned from promiscuity, perversion, and 1,000 variations on self-abuse that we will not be happy just because we have many and varied orgasms. We learn, in a word, that our lusts do indeed pass away, sometimes even before we do. Now, if we have learned this, and some people have, if we no longer hope to be made happy by pleasure or presented with unqualified boons by scientific and technological power, then what? Then, I suggest, the worm may turn and bite its own tail. Indeed, I think that is what has happened. Disillusioned with pleasure and with power, we have returned to the ideal of knowledge for its own sake, only this time with a new twist. The knowledge for which we seek after we have discarded the motives of power and pleasure tends to be a pure magical gnosis, a self-sufficing and all-sufficing insight from which every suggestion of instrumentality, utility, and carnality have been removed. Knowledge not as a means of beatitude, but as itself beatitude. Something that would be a lot like mystical rapture, were it not more like the ultimate high. In the subtitle to this talk, I promised some reflections on the philosophy fad. I gave that title to Doug Browning for publicity purposes a long time ago. Had I known then what I know now, the registration figures for philosophy courses this spring, I might have amended the subtitle to read Reflections on the Recent Philosophy Fad. Be that as it may, I shall be discussing perhaps the immediate past, but I trust that that past, if gone, is not yet forgotten, so we may still learn from it. There has been, then, a philosophy fad. Philosophy classes were filled to overflowing. Instructors were not sure if they should be angry at being overworked or delighted because philosophy had at last caught on. But who were these people crowding their classes? I want to make an insulting suggestion. The insult now is generic, so it doesn't apply to you distributively, and none of you needs take it personally. And it is not quite my last word on the subject, but here it is anyway. Those people who, until just this spring, at least, were filling and overfilling philosophy courses were a lot of reactionaries. What I mean, I can illustrate. A lot of radicals take, or used to take, courses in political philosophy. Now, it is obvious, I assume, that the radical has not renounced the motive of power. On the contrary, he embraces it enthusiastically. And if the radical studies philosophy in order to acquire the rationale, if not the instrument of power, then to that extent, and in the terms of my discussion today, he is a reactionary. I understand that many radicals have now forsaken philosophy for things like accounting, in order, presumably, that they may work within the system in their own way. That, at any rate, is consistent. There's another very large group of people who patronize, even more who used to patronize, courses in Oriental philosophy, especially Hinduism and Buddhism. A great many of them, I suspect, were looking in philosophy for what I have called pure gnosis, or magical knowledge, knowledge that would of itself beatify them. They could not look for that in their own tradition, for their own tradition had rejected or compromised the impulse to beatitude, just as it had betrayed the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. And so they turned to the East, where, at least it was easy to believe this if you were a Westerner, where the hunger and thirst for pure consciousness had survived unalloyed and unallayed. That, again, I see as a form of reaction. And finally, though doubtless these classes overlap, and the list is not exhaustive, there have been a lot of people who went to philosophy for fun. That is, for the sheer pleasure of doing something that would not fit them for a place in a society they despised, something that would not get them a job in a world that had only odious jobs to offer, something that would be totally unproductive of anything but pleasure for themselves. If not the ultimate high, then at least the ultimate cool. They too, at least insofar as their desire for pleasure is concerned, are reactionaries. You see then, if this is true, the people who created the philosophy fad were not rejecting the motives I attributed to that poor graduate student back in Part 1, curiosity, vanity, and commerce. For curiosity is just another name for the desire for magical knowledge. Commerce is another expression for the means of power, and vanity has surely no reward except pleasure. The philosophy fad was, in these terms, just the most recent spasm in the history of these classic and classically disparaged motives: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. It is not hard, even for me, to imagine the most obvious objection to all this. There are lots of less obvious objections that I will let you think up. I will mention only the obvious one that even I can think of. And it is this: aren't you, after all, the real reactionary? Hasn't everything you've said, in effect, recommended the rejection of progress and novelty and the adoption of an antiquated, not to mention Christian and medieval, point of view. Why else would you quote St. John and St. Bernard with approval and cavalierly put down everything since then from Francis Bacon to us? Exactly. And now I shall have to deal with that in Part 3, How to Live, What to Do. In this third and last part of my talk, I want to propose not what you might expect, not a return to the good old days of the 12th century, but just a simple thesis. The thesis is that philosophy is essentially religious. Perhaps I should explain what I mean. The title for this lecture, How to Live, What to Do, and for this part of the lecture also, was stolen. It is by rights the title of a short poem by Wallace Stevens. And now I want to proceed to steal the entire poem. Here it is. Last evening the moon rose above this rock, impure upon a world unpurged. The man and his companion stopped to rest before the heroic height. Coldly the wind fell upon them in many majesties of sound. They that had left the flame-freaked sun to seek a sun of fuller fire. Instead, there was this tufted rock, massively rising high and bare beyond all trees, the ridges thrown like giant arms among the clouds. There was neither voice nor crested image, no chorister nor priest. There was only the great height of the rock, and the two of them standing still to rest. There was the cold wind and the sound it made, away from the muck of the land that they had left. Heroic sound, joyous and jubilant and sure. There are many things that this poem would reveal to a complete analysis and appreciation, but I'm using it as a means merely, and so I take from it the one thing that serves my turn, the impulse of transcendence. When I say that philosophy is essentially religious, what I mean is the fundamental philosophical motive is the motive of transcendence. On behalf of this thesis, I can offer not really an argument, only a kind of persuasion. If you ask another philosophy student, don't take a graduate student this time, ask a beginner in philosophy, or perhaps just a sophomore contemplating a philosophy major. If you ask him why he's interested in philosophy, he may tell you something like this: because there are some important questions I want to get answered. Questions like, where did I come from? Who am I? Where am I going? And only philosophy seems even likely to answer them. These are the sorts of questions that are usually called big questions, sometimes, in scare quotes, deep. It has become a habit among philosophers, at least among the pros, to ridicule the big questions, to say that they're unanswerable, or that they are so carelessly and vaguely formulated as to be unintelligible, or even that they are meaningless, that they are not really questions, because they wrench words out of common usage, or because they do not suggest empirically testable answers. But it is, I think, pernicious to ridicule the big questions. It dishonors and insults the human concern that prompts them. It not only avoids the issue, It affronts the humanity and the spiritual concern of those who confront and in their questions interrogate the mystery of being. To come on that way in philosophy is to offer us stones for bread and to suggest that we are foolish for wanting to eat. I might add that to make little of the big questions is also philosophically suicidal. Philosophers must, to be sure, deal with a lot of little questions, tough little questions, in their pursuit of knowledge. But it is the big questions that are the whole reason for studying philosophy. They are the only thing that makes the little questions even interesting. And to drum them out or laugh them down is to submit to intellectual sterilization. One should not ridicule the big questions, then, or call them meaningless, dismiss them. Rather, one should recognize that big questions require big answers. The positivist critique, and likewise the linguistic critique, have made it clear that the big questions are not like the little ones. Who am I is not at all like what is the chemical composition of moon rock. From this, the positivist and sometimes the linguistic philosopher conclude that the big questions are not really questions, for something like the same reason that mother of pearl is not a real mother. But I would think it wiser, and at least more open-minded, to conclude otherwise, namely, not that the big questions aren't questions, but that they are questions of a different order from the little ones, questions that address a different domain of reality and a different dimension of experience than the little questions. In short, that they are questions which transcend the realms of common usage, empirical testing, or conceptual reduction in the direction of mystery. And in fact, philosophers always do ask and try to answer the big questions, though some do it out loud and others, as it were, under their breath. Every philosopher has some conception of the subject matter of his discipline. In fact, at one level of generality, a very high one, all philosophers have the same conception of their subject matter. Every philosopher, tacitly at least, takes as his domain, as the object of his study, everything knowable. Everything knowable. Differences among them boil down to differences over what there is, that is, what everything includes, and differences over how much of it can be known and how we can know it. Plato and David Hume alike agree that they are, as philosophers, concerned in principle with everything that can be known. But everything, for Plato, is a large and rich and bewildering array. For Hume, it seems to come down to a couple of classes of sense data. Their ideas about how we get to know things are similarly diverse. Now, decisions about these matters, about what there is and how we know it, are made antecedently to the formulation of philosophical doctrines and systems. They express, or at least betray, the quality and the scope of the philosopher's faith, and they are seldom formulated in doctrines. Philosophers are not often fully self-conscious about what it is they really believe. That is especially true of those philosophers who have no use for big questions. Therefore, if I have seemed to approve the thought of an antique or even antiquated period like the 12th century, it is not because I want to go back there or am so foolish as to think one could. It is in part because men of that time did know what they believed and were therefore able to be self-critical in a way and to a degree that has seldom been surpassed. The age of faith, you know, did not end at the Renaissance. All philosophers, like all men, are men of faith. The difference is that in older times, philosophers were self-conscious about their faith, so that it liberated them more often than it bound them. But my point is not to praise times gone by. My point is that this element of what I have called faith, at the root of every philosophy, is in effect, if not in fact, the philosopher's way of answering the big questions, regardless of how he treats them professionally. And this element of faith, which transcends and grounds all systems and doctrines, is a sign of what I have called the religious character of philosophy. I've called it faith, but I don't care about the word. It could as well be called imagination. And there's something to be said for men whose imagination is bold enough to locate everything in a circle whose circumference embraced more than all finite things taken together, and whose imaginative fortitude was great enough to make questions of method and epistemology secondary to their preparedness for encounter with mystery. What I have wanted to suggest and to recommend is that all philosophy is essentially religious in this sense, that its fundamental motive is transcendence. If this be the case, then it cannot be a sign of philosophic weakness to acknowledge the fact. In reality, it seems to me every philosopher who is worthy of his birthright knows perfectly well that he is engaged with a truth that is really quite beyond him, and which he may expect to meet him in ways and along avenues not predicted by his methodology. It's strange to me that Western philosophers, modern ones at least, have been so suspicious of mysticism, that they have dismissed it without examination and have even habitually misunderstood it. Strange when you consider that the whole drive of reason is toward the inconceivable and the whole project of language to broach the unutterable. But perhaps it is not so strange. A great deal of the modern history of philosophy has been the story of the constriction of her imagination. Well, I warned you that I wasn't going to tell you how to live or what to do, and I haven't. But I have meant to suggest that how to live and what to do, taken in the very largest sense, is what philosophy is all about. And now perhaps we can come back once more to the previously maligned philosophy fad, render it its due, and so make an end. For the people I insultingly called reactionaries were not just that. Or if they were also reactionaries in the sense that I am. For they were, in one way or another, insisting on the big questions. And if it is true, and not just a statistical anomaly, that they have now forsaken philosophy, it may be because they found her unresponsive to their deeper motives. The student who turns to Eastern philosophy and religion may be seeking instant and magical beatification, but he may also be looking beyond magic and beyond the power and the pleasure that are the diabolic divinities of modern Western society for the grounds of ultimate commitment, something he can really believe in a society and in an age that have become quite literally incredible. Or the student who takes philosophy for the sake of its unproductive pleasure. He may be just indulging himself at the expense of his parents and his society, but he may also be seeking, beyond the carnal and transient delectations sanctified by his culture, for the source of ultimate and abiding satisfaction. And the radical who takes philosophy to learn about power, he may be trying to take over the world, but he may also be looking beyond the abuses of power and privilege that have become canonized among us for the ultimate norms by which any exercise of power is to be judged. I said a little while ago that the motives of those people who made up the philosophy fad were the motives of curiosity, vanity, and commerce. What I now want to suggest is that the motives of curiosity, vanity, and commerce are themselves simply parodies or inversions of another set of motives. Suppose a man is seeking in philosophy for the grounds of ultimate commitment. That may be another name for faith. Suppose a man studies philosophy because he desires ultimate satisfaction. That may be another name for hope. And suppose a man studies philosophy because he wants in his actions to cleave to the ultimate norm. That may be another name for charity. Curiosity, vanity, and commerce may be just the obverse of faith, hope, and charity. And faith, hope, and charity, it seems to me, is not a bad trinity to put up against the world, the flesh, and the devil. I've said several times now that I'm not going to tell you how to live or what to do, but I will make just one suggestion. Some of you are, or will be, students of philosophy. For a semester only, perhaps, maybe for a couple of years, or even for a lifetime. Whatever the term of your engagement with philosophy, demand the most of her. Insist on the big questions, and don't be put off by little answers or none at all. If enough people do that, then the philosophy fad will not have been a fad at all. It will have been a new resurgence of the perennial philosophic motive, the motive of transcendence. It will have been a new quickening and flourishing of the philosophical imagination. For beyond the world unpurged, beyond the flame-freaked sun and the muck of the land, rises the tufted rock, high and bare. And only there, at that great height, can the wind of heaven be heard, an heroic sound, joyous and jubilant and sure.